All right, nobody freak out, but I think we might have to give up part of Texas. Not quite yet, but sometime in the future, it might be in the cards. I just watched this interview between Tucker Carlson and Steve Witkoff. He's the president's special envoy to try to find peace in Ukraine, and he ran through these bullet points of referendums in Ukraine where the Ukrainian people want to be a part of Russia, and then he started talking about the languages that people are speaking there. And I thought, I'm going to do some research, and I went down this rabbit hole, and I came out the other side, and it's not good. It's not good for us here in the United States. I like Texas. Mexico can't just have Texas because some people there, in Texas speak Spanish. That's not how this works. But anyways, let's back it up. Let's start with the interview. Here's what Witkoff had to say to Carlson.
First of all, I think the largest issue in that conflict are these so-called four regions: Donbass,
yes.
Crimea, the names Lugansk, and there's two others. They're Russian-speaking.
Yep.
There have been referendums where the overwhelming majority of the people have indicated that they want to be under Russian rule.
Yes.
I think that's the key issue in the conflict. So that's the first thing.
All right. So I saw this and I was like, oh, well, that makes sense if that's the case, right? Like, it's pretty clear cut. So I went over some research, right, and started digging into this. And I thought I'd start with the referendums because it can't be any simpler. If a people vote and say, hey, we want to be a part of this country, not that country, then who are we to step in and say, like, actually, you got that wrong and we need to fix this, right? So I went down this rabbit hole, and I've got a map here to show you these 5 different areas, not 4, but 5 different areas of Ukraine that are currently occupied by Russia to talk about some of these referendums because they just it's a slam dunk. They've got 99% approval. Are you kidding me? Can you imagine getting 99% of people to agree to anything? But in this case, Russia did. That's how much they unified the people under their occupation. So starting back in 2014 is really when these first referendums came about, and there were 3. So it's the pink areas here on the map. We've got Luhansk up here, the furthest north, then Donetsk and Crimea. And there's kind of 2 different stories between these. Now, the first thing that really stood out to me is this pink area on the map is what Russian forces were able to occupy in 2014. So when they held this referendum to say, hey, who here in Luhansk and Donetsk wants to be a part of Russia, unfortunately, they weren't able to, actually poll the entire portion of those oblasts because they didn't control it all. So they could only bring people to the polls where they had military control, if that makes sense. So, there's going to be a little variation here, and we got to take that with a grain of salt and kind of understand the limitations that Russia had. They were in the middle of fighting a war, right? They were in the process of taking over territory, right? They had a lot of fighting going on at the front. There was only so much they could do to actually hold these elections and see the will of the people through. So anyways, when looking at Luhansk and Donetsk, we do have a couple results here that I thought were worth walking through. Let's see, in Donetsk, this is on May 11th, 2014. So right here, Donetsk actually voted 89% in favor of independence, not necessarily joining Russia. That's going to come later. And then Luhansk, get this, 96%. So they got this section right here, found all the people. There's things are so good right now under Russian occupation. 96% of people. 96 is incredible to get those numbers in any sort of election. Russians must be all over it. So anyways, no other issues here. Of course, international community kind of condemned these and said it was, there's ballot stuffing. There was no credible monitoring, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Of course, nobody in these other portions was able to vote. And then strangely, which, we'll come back to this later, but for whatever reason, the pre-war polling was closer to 30%. But then as soon as they did these elections with Russian soldiers around, that went up to 90+%. But there's probably they were probably just so happy that the Russians were there that it brought out their Russian patriotism is probably what I'm thinking. Then the other big one here is Crimea. And this is the area down here. And the Crimean one, the referendum there is actually really interesting because it was in 2014, in March of 2014, and they had 2 votes available. And again, I think it's worth mentioning that the referendum had to wait until after Russian forces got in there because if the Russian military wasn't there taking over the territory to watch people vote, then how would we even know what the will of the people is going to be, right? So anyways, the Russians went in, they took Crimea by force, and then they held their election in March. And this was weird because I don't understand why they would do this. There were only 2 options on the ballot. So option 1 was joining Russia, becoming a part of Russia, and option 2 was independence from Ukraine. It's like, well, the current setup was that they were a part of Ukraine. It feels, I don't understand this entirely, but Russian stuff maybe. It seems like don't change could have been one of the options on there, but it wasn't. So the Crimean voters here either had the option of joining Russia or leaving Ukraine, which kind of 2-1 in a lot of ways. But either way, definitive results there, of course, as to be expected. 97% of voters there in Crimea. 83% turned out, by the way, and 96.7% of those said, we actually want to join Russia. So again, there's just this thing, this aura that Russia has where when they take over an area and they have military forces there, the people are just like, this is the best thing ever. And they unify like nothing I've ever seen really anywhere. So that actually takes us to 2022. And these referendums are important because when we get into the language piece, it's just going to blow your mind because that's when it really starts to like hit home that we might be in trouble here in the United States. But these 2022 referendums, now we're talking about more of this orangish, reddish territory that Russia took after their invasion in 2022. And in that referendum, it was in September. And they held it in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. And again, part of the challenge here is, unfortunately, Russia could only hold these referendums in areas that they controlled and they had military forces, right? So when you're looking at Zaporozhye, there's still portions that are under Ukrainian control. They weren't able to vote in this at all. So, and the same, there's still a big chunk of Donetsk that isn't able to vote. Not to mention, like, there's a lot of areas near the front where the people aren't there, right? Because there's a war going on and they've had to leave and go elsewhere, and there's no like remote voting. Same as the 2014. There was a lot of criticism from the international community about ballot stuffing. There was no third-party verification, intimidation at the ballot booths, and all that stuff that we just kind of expect throughout these referendums. It's kind of been a norm from 2014 on. But when we look at these 2022 numbers, this is going to blow your mind. So let's start up here in Donetsk. You ready for this? Right here. 99.23% voted to join Russia. That's what I'm talking about. See, like once the Russian military, all they had to do was take more of the territory. They just had to have more military in there, and they bumped those numbers up. Last time around they were in there, it was 89%, right? So just take over more territory, kill more people, destroy more of the buildings, and you're like, there's your 7%. Russia's got it figured out. Shifting over to Luhansk, they jumped up to 98%, which I didn't know that there could even be an improvement from 96% voting in favor of something. But Luhansk figured it out, and they were just, again, same thing. It's this formula that Putin has figured out where it's like boots on the ground, tanks rolling through the streets, bomb the shit out of everything in front of us. Those people are going to vote for, like, no matter what they love us. They've got it. But shifting over to Zaporozhye, it starts to fall off here a little bit. Kind of embarrassing for Russia, if I'm being honest. Only 87% of Zaporozhye voted to join Russia, which is, my expectations are now skewed. I expect 90% or bust. So 87% to me seems like there's a lot of dissent there that we probably need to, I don't know what the issue is in Zaporozhye, but Kherson was actually even worse. Kherson was 87%. Zaporozhye was 93%. So Kherson is the one over here. Now, it might have been that there's a big chunk of Kherson that still wasn't under Russian control, maybe, but they couldn't vote, so they couldn't have voted no. It's confusing seeing the variation in the numbers here. It's hard to explain a 93% approval when, in the same vote, you're getting 99%. You know what I'm saying? But anyways, shifting away from this, I thought, a big part of this that Witkoff is talking about is not just the referendums, because when I think of this here in the United States, there's no referendum going on to where like any state or town or county is like, we want to leave the United States and join someone else. So we don't really have to worry about that. And like, if we do have to worry about it, clearly Russia's got it figured out. 99% approval, get out of here. We just got to ask Putin, like, what is the method? How do you teach us your ways in getting everybody to love us that we take over? But when looking at the language piece, this was something where I was like, that's actually a thing here in the United States, right? We have a lot of people here in the U.S. that don't speak English, especially as their first language. So like, all right, so let's check that out. And I pulled up this map of Ukrainian territory showing where some of these where some of these Russian-speaking versus Ukrainian-speaking areas are. And let's go over here to the Luhansk and Donetsk area, and you'll see up in Luhansk, it's 68% that speak Russian, the Russian speakers. That's their primary language, right? So it doesn't mean they don't speak Ukrainian. It's just 70%, 68% Russian is the primary language in their home. Like, okay, that's high. Honestly, I thought it'd be higher because remember, we're talking like 96% plus that want to join Russia. But either way, then moving on to Donetsk, a little higher, 74%, right? So that's a good chunk. But then it actually falls off quite a bit. And we see down in Zaporozhye, it's like less than half. Or, 49% is the majority here, and they say Ukrainian, so it's got to be 49% or less speak Russian. So now we're kind of getting into weird territory. We're like, I don't know, this feels a little bit off. And then Kherson, it's 28% for Russian. I'm like, I don't know, I feel like 28%, there's probably areas in the United States where like 28% of the population speaks another language over English, right? And that's where this is where it went off the rails. I'm telling you, I went down a rabbit hole here. So I pulled up some maps and was like, Spanish speaking areas of the United States, first language, things like that. Like, and Texas, of course, is where we land, right? Shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And I love Texas. Used to live in Texas. I still have a lot of family in Texas. Make it back there as often as I can. But here's where it gets bad, guys. We're going to have to, according to Witkoff, we might have to give up like a good chunk of Texas. And I'm not even getting into Arizona and New Mexico and Miami. Miami's gone by this rationale, which love it or hate it, it's ours. And this is where I start to kind of come unwound because like this doesn't work. You can't do this. You can't. Here's a map. I got the map up here of where Spanish is the primary language spoken by the residents here. And if you look at Texas, anybody who's been down there, this probably isn't a big shock, but like especially near the border, you got like, 61 to 91% of the population there, Spanish is their first language. That's higher than some of the areas in eastern Ukraine that speak Russian. So that's not good. We should not be using that language thing. That is we got to write that off. We got to squash that. This whole Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine, that doesn't help us. That hurts us. This is a problem. I mean, we were talking about how in Kherson, one of the regions that Russia is now claiming as their own, partially because of the number of Russian speakers that are there, is like 25%. If we drop down to 25% here in the United States, this is a bad day, guys. I mean, again, just looking at Texas here, I hate to say it, but the entire southwest portion of the state is gone. We've got no claim to that anymore. Mexico is going to come in. They're going to say, hey, look at all these Spanish speakers. We want San Antonio. They might even push out to Houston. Dallas has me a little bit concerned when I'm looking at this. They're going to have to get through some, only 20% Spanish-speaking population, but there's a pathway, right? There's a land bridge, possibly, from San Antonio or Houston to Dallas that could be exploited by Mexico. And I don't know, maybe they've got the support down there. This is what we got to do away with this language thing. It sounded okay when Witkoff said it the first time. The further I get down this rabbit hole, it seems like a really bad idea. So anyways, kind of wrapping this whole thing up, hopefully we don't have to cede Mexican territory because they can't do that. They can't just say, because they speak Spanish, it's ours. And it doesn't matter that a long time ago, it might have been theirs. That's not how this works. They can't just take it because of a language that some people speak, that American citizens speak inside of our country. Okay? You can't do that. That's not how the world works in 2025. So we gotta watch this whole Russian language speaking in Eastern Ukraine thing, because I feel like that could be a problem for us and probably some other people around the world. And then, of course, we went through the referendums, airtight, no issues there at all. Clearly, 99% of the people, they've spoken, right? Russia's figured this out. You invade people, you bomb their homes, you kill their families, and they vote to join you forever and ever. So no questions on the referendums, of course, but the language thing, let's agree here and now. Let's cut that out. Doesn't do anyone any good.